Hi, welcome to Unit 2 in our Methods course. And in this 2 weeks in Unit 2, what we're going to tackle is we're going to tackle both the big pieces and some finer details of what it means to teach reading effectively to English language learners. If you're headed to K through 12, there is so much that I'm going to share with you that actually applies as well for your native speakers. So today what we're going to do is we're going to tackle the really big pieces, kind of the big paintbrush strokes. And let's just take a look. This might look a little daunting, but here's the terms that we're going to kind of take up and make meaning with and actually use today. We're going to learn some terms: bottom-up approach, top-down approach, interactive approach. Here's one that if you took second language acquisition, you will recognize, called the natural approach. This was Stephen Krashen's method, and we'll talk about it once we get into the lecture. But essentially, just to jog your memory, he was the first person who said it matters how students feel in our classes. It matters what kind of materials we put in their hands, and that we should not be trying to get them to memorize to learn, but rather we should just expose them to wonderful input that they can take in as intake, make sense of, and then acquire language from. So that's what natural approach refers to. Schema theory: if you're an education student, you might already have encountered this term, and we'll add a slightly possible different meaning to it for you. Communicative competencies: we talked about this in second language acquisition. This concept, communicative competencies, is so key to understanding how to teach language learners across the skills. It will come up in each of our units in this course. And so we will take a look at those 4 competencies: grammatical competency, discourse competency, sociolinguistic competency, and strategic competency. Specifically, we'll be taking a look at what does it mean for within the skill of reading. What does grammatical competency mean? And then some other terms. Fluency and accuracy will be quite important to today's lecture. We will look at the difference and kind of get a sense of the role in our teaching that they need to take, the difference between intensive reading and extensive reading. We will get a clear sense of the difference between skimming and scanning, very important for our teaching. And we will get a sense of the difference between thin questions and thick questions. Okay. So the place that I want to start is to get you to think about what's the image that comes to your mind when you think about the skill of reading, when you think about someone reading. So what comes up? My guess is that an image that comes up for you is very much related to when the Impressionist painters painted people reading, and often they were women. And they were often given titles like the reader. And often what you would see is a woman reclining on a chair or sitting on a blanket in a park, very much doing nothing, it would seem, except holding the book. And sometimes even the book was just on her lap, so she wasn't even having to hold it. And so I want us to start there because I want you to notice that it's very likely that you and everyone you encounter has a sense of reading as a very passive activity, as something that is more pleasurable than not, that is very passive, where you're simply letting your eyes run across the page and there's really not much more to be done with it. Also, that it's often seen as an independent activity, something that you do alone. So I want us to kind of notice that image. It's great if that's not the image that you're coming to this lecture with, but that's very much the place where most of us begin. And our work today in this lecture is to disrupt that idea, if not for yourself, to give you kind of the ammunition that you need to disrupt that idea for others. Because reading is one of the biggest jobs that our language learners have. And if you've spent time with someone who's really struggling to learn to read for the first time, so a young child or perhaps an English language learner who didn't learn to read in their first language, and so now they're learning to do it for the first time in their second language, in English, then you very much have a sense of what that challenge looks like and what that texture looks like. So we're really going to engage with that. What is that struggle? What's going on? And what are the implications for us as instructors? What can we be doing in our class to directly support our students with what they need? Okay, so I think that the place I want to begin is this little time chart that I created here. This is nothing official. This is the way Gina sees the world. And so when I think about the skill of reading, I really see it in kind of these 3 time zones. And the first begins in the Middle Ages and comes up to the 1970s. And the 1970s and the 1980s kind of stand out for me in my understanding of how we've thought about and approached and taught reading. And then a new time zone beginning in the 1990s and moving forward. And so I'm going to constantly be going back to this time chart to kind of make sense, share with you how I make sense of how we've approached reading, what we've found out, what we now have packed in our kind of our teaching luggage that we take with us, and what we've let go. Okay. So if we start with the Middle Ages, then if you've taken second language acquisition, you know that our prevalent idea of teaching language came from the grammar translation method. The grammar translation method was built on a belief that the reason that anyone would learn another language is simply to read and translate important texts. And of course, the original language that everyone was attempting to learn as a second language, or as a foreign language, was Latin. And the reason I say foreign language is by the time Latin was formally taught in classrooms, it was already dead. And so the reason that people were learning Latin was so that they could get access to those original texts that were thought of as so significant to intellectual understanding of the world. And those texts were written in Latin. So in the Middle Ages, reading was the very purpose for learning another language. Reading was the very purpose. And the imagining of reading was nothing like the Impressionist paintings of women in repose with a book on their lap in a park. It was very much thought of as hard intellectual labor. And the way that reading was tackled was through memorization of vocabulary and memorization and practice with grammar exercises. So reading was tackled like almost like a mathematical equation that had to be taken apart and solved. And so how did you solve it? You solved it with vocabulary, kind of decoded with vocabulary. You decoded with grammar. You ended up with a meaning for a sentence. And reading was very much thought of as, at first, for beginners, just sentence by sentence. So students might encounter an entire page of sentences. Sentence number 1 has nothing to do with sentence number 2, which has nothing to do with sentence number 3. There was no focus on greater understanding, on making greater meaning, making connections. It was only on decoding. Decode the grammar, decode the vocabulary, and that's where the focus is. So that is where we stayed, really, in our understanding of how reading should be taught. And it was very much a bottom-up approach. So what does that mean? A bottom-up approach is when you are focusing on the structures, the little pieces that make up a skill or that students need to tackle a task. So when you think about, from the Middle Ages up until about the 1970s, when you think about how teachers prepared students to read, they were using a bottom-up approach because they were working on the little pieces like vocabulary and grammar. So just those structures. In fact, that's called the structuralist approach, if that's the predominant way that you approach teaching language. So the bottom-up approach was very, very prevalent until the 1970s. That's the way it rolled. So if you had intermediate students or advanced students and they were getting ready to read a really big text, not just a sentence, but a really big text, you would, before you would send them off with their long reading that they needed to do for their homework, the pre-reading, the pre-teaching that you would do would be entirely bottom-up. What would you do? You would teach them the grammar they needed to decode that text. You would teach them the vocabulary that they would need access to understand the text. So you would send them off with those pieces, which I'm sure were quite helpful. But as we'll see, there were other ideas about what might be missing from that. Now in the 1970s, a few things changed. And one that changed is the dawn of the natural approach. Stephen Krashen's theory, hypotheses, set of hypotheses and method, in which what he believed was students need to be exposed to language. They don't necessarily need to be taught about language. And they need to be exposed to it in a way that they can understand it, and they can understand it in an almost automatic way or automatic way. And so there was a great focus here on making meaning. And there was a great focus here, not on decoding the grammar, decoding the vocabulary, but rather just intuiting the meaning, have an understanding. So in the natural approach, when students were in class and they were being exposed to oral language, the teacher might have lots and lots of realia, lots and lots of pictures, and the teacher would be just using the target language, for us, English, and caring about their day and making sure that everything they're saying, students have a way to make sense of. So if they're talking about, for example, if they're talking about a thermos, they're holding the thermos, they're pointing at the thermos. If they're talking about what they did that morning, they're acting it out. They're drawing pictures on the board. So they're giving students a sense of meaning, a way to make meaning, in which they're more directly experiencing the text itself. Whether that's an oral text, it's what the teacher is saying, or whether it's a written text. So there was very much a different approach to reading that came about here, and it's really all focused on meaning. And so in the 1970s, you've got the natural approach, and you've got people starting to think about reading in a very different way. Not reading as the purpose for learning language, but rather reading as the means for learning language, because that's going to provide the input, that's going to provide what hopefully the student will take as intake as well. So you've got the natural approach, but you've also got a new kind of way of thinking about language, and that is the schema theory. Underline natural approach as well. So we've got schema theory here. And schema theory was originally an idea that came out of cognitive psychology. It was a theory of how we learn, and it came out in 1932. But it was pretty much, at least for our profession and for the general education profession, pretty much ignored until the 1970s. And in the 1970s, suddenly there was this view that what we needed to do was to access students' schema before they read or as they're reading. Now, what is schema? Schema is kind of an area of understanding, or some people say a unit of understanding. I don't like that word very much. So I'll just say an area of understanding. And how do you get that area of understanding? It might come through experience. It might come through kind of a cultural view of the world. It might come from previous teaching. It might come from students' stories that they've read, things that they've taken in. They haven't directly experienced themselves, maybe anecdotes that have been shared with them. So schema is what the students already know about the world, what they come to the reading text already knowing about the world. And schema theory says that the way that we make sense of a text, well, the way that we build any learning, is by connecting it to the schema that's already built. So in other words, there's the learning that you walk in with, and if you want to really understand this text, you've got to find a way to connect that text to what students already know and build from there. Kind of makes sense, right? Makes good intuitive sense. And part of the reason it probably makes intuitive sense to me and to you is because a lot of our education has been built on this. Hopefully a lot of great teaching that you've had has connected what today's learning is with what we did last week or what you already come knowing about the world. And so those two changes in the 1970s really kicked off a very different approach to how we teach reading and how we prepare students to tackle a reading. And so what came about because of the natural approach and because of schema theory is the top-down approach. Now, we talked about the bottom-up approach, and the bottom-up approach in our field means focusing on the little structures of that make up meaning. And for us, principally, that usually refers to grammar, vocabulary, and sometimes at the level of making phoneme-grapheme connections. Phoneme means what you say, and grapheme means the way it's written. So, for example, with the word approach, when I see that letter P, I make the P sound if I'm reading out loud. So often with bottom-up approach, especially with beginners who are still struggling with understanding how the English alphabet works, or it might be their first encounter with an alphabet ever, that would be a part of the bottom-up approach for them and the way that the teacher would prepare them. Making sure that they remember the difference between B and V, or between L and R, for example. Top-down approach. Top-down approach focuses on meaning, and it focuses on purpose, and it focuses on genre. So what does that mean? So if someone's teaching reading with the top-down approach, what that means is that when they give their students a new reading, they will get their students thinking about what's the main idea of this text. So what kinds of things might they have the student do? They might have the students quickly move their eye through the text, especially the first few paragraphs, trying to identify what's the main idea, whether it's stated or it's indirectly stated. It might also mean that they are getting their students to think about what's the purpose of this text. So they might look at the title, look if there's a picture of the author, look at the genre type, and try to guess. Am I being told something? Is the author trying to persuade me of something? Is this a funny piece and it's actually meant to entertain me? What's my relationship with the author? That would be another aspect. Another aspect, very much related, would be triggering everything that the student knows about that genre so far. So for example, if you're putting a science reading in front of students, getting them to think about how does reading a text in science work, right? With science, we know there's lots of new vocabulary on every page. And so often there's a glossary. Maybe it's in the sidebar on each page, maybe it's at the bottom of the page, maybe it's at the end of the chapter. But there's usually a glossary somewhere. So triggering what they already know about how the discourse works. So let's connect that with the competencies for a moment. So when we talk about bottom-up approach is entirely focused on grammatical competency. And grammatical competency means exactly the same thing as the bottom-up approach. The competency is just what you need to do to be successful with a task or a text. And the bottom-up approach means the way a teacher is approaching the teaching of something. But essentially, they're referring to the same thing: vocabulary, grammar, and the little pieces like phoneme-grapheme relationships. So the sounds versus the way something is written. When we talk about top-down approach, we're talking about discourse competency, so having a sense, let me move this over a little bit, having a sense of how the genre works, having a sense of if you show part of a television program to your students as part of a listening activity, for example, the students would have a sense, is this going to be a funny show? Am I going to be entertained? Is this informative? Is it a documentary? Is what the person's saying, is this true? Is this a true story? Or is this just a made-up story? That kind of thing. And so that's examples of what discourse competency means. Top-down approach also refers to sociolinguistic competency. And sociolinguistic competency means, in part, what's my relationship with the author? What's my relationship with this text? What kinds of things can I expect to see in the text? What kinds of things can be said? What kinds of things aren't said? What kind of vocabulary is appropriate? What kind of vocabulary is not appropriate? Now, one thing that I want you to recognize is even though bottom-up approach nicely and neatly can be tied up with grammatical competency, the top-down approach cannot neatly be kind of boiled down to discourse competency and sociolinguistic competency. There's more going on. For example, with top-down approach, there is also a focus on the main idea. There's also a focus on kind of having a sense, an overall sense of where the other main ideas of the text reside as well. So there's a little bit more going on than simply the author's purpose and how the genre works, but also what kinds of things the students might encounter there, what kinds of questions might be answered, that kind of thing. So top-down approach is a little more complex than bottom-up approach. So what you had happen in the 1970s is you've got these two pieces, the natural approach and schema theory, and they both just impacted the way we thought about the teaching of reading so much. So much so that in our field, the pendulum swung very drastically from the bottom-up approach to top-down approach. And suddenly, the way that students were being prepared for a reading or being supported through a reading included very little at all of the bottom-up approach. People all but abandoned the teaching of grammar and vocabulary before someone read. I say all but. There were some holdouts. And there were, as close as we get in our field to fistfights between those who still clung to the bottom-up approach and those newbies who really thought that the top-down approach made a lot of sense. And so a researcher in the skill of reading, Patricia Carroll, she said, enough is enough. I really need to know which is better. And so she devised an experiment in the 1980s in which she took 3 groups of international students. They were all intermediate learners, and they were all tackling the learning of English, and specifically the skill of reading. And they were all preparing to do university work, which meant they needed very quickly to be able to read at a fast rate and to understand most of what they read. So she took a very large number of international students, all at the same university, all at the same level, and she divided them into 3 groups. Each of the groups was given the same reading to do, and so the same reading for homework, just very much like we do in our classes. If you're teaching the skill of reading, or if you're teaching content in K through 12, for example, you're often sending your students home with reading homework. So the reading was all the same, the students were the same, their context was the same, and they all got 30 minutes of instruction before they went home to tackle that reading on their own. So the difference was in the instruction. In the first group, they received 30 minutes of bottom-up instruction. And what that means is, for 30 minutes, their instructor prepared them with the vocabulary that they needed and the grammar that they would encounter to make sure that they understood it and they would be able to decode it. So that's group 1. Group 2, they were also given 30 minutes of pre-reading instruction, but this was using the top-down approach. So what kinds of things happened? The instructor talked to them about the main idea. The instructor talked to them about the genre and what to expect. The instructor had them look at any headings, any bolded words, make predictions, come up with questions that they thought the text might answer, that kind of thing. Think about the purpose. And so that was group 2. Group 3, they used what Carol now calls the interactive approach. And for this group, that 30 minutes was evenly divided. For 15 minutes, they got the bottom-up approach, vocabulary, grammar, and for 30 minutes, they got for 15 minutes rather, the other 15 minutes, they got the top-down approach. And for the top-down approach, they were, just as I mentioned before, besides just the vocabulary and the grammar, they were getting what's the purpose, what's the main idea, what's the genre, accessing the schema, what can you guess from the genre, that kind of thing. So we've got group 1, group 2, and group 3. So before I give you the answer, make a prediction, just silently to yourself, or shout out at your screen, I don't care. But which group do you think did the best? Which group do you think came in number 2, and which group came in number 3? And when I say did the best, what I mean is all the students were given a comprehension questionnaire and assessment when they came back to class. And then that was graded to see how much they were able to understand. So, if you said that the group that had access to both kinds of instruction, even though it was no more time, did the best, you were right. So what Carol found was that if we really want students to fully understand a reading text, we don't need to throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's not time to simply abandon the bottom-up approach as if there's no more use for it. Rather, we need to incorporate it into what we do. But absolutely, schema theory is right. Students really need access to those big ideas, the main idea, all of that to make sense of a text. So interactive approach is the way to go, according to Patricia Carroll's research. Now, you will find when you are teaching that sometimes you haven't managed time as well as you thought. So maybe you would set aside 15 minutes to preview reading for your students. and you look at the clock and there's 5 minutes left. So the decision is, well, with 5 minutes, which is going to make the biggest impact? Bottom-up approach or top-down approach? What do you think? If you said top-down approach, you're right. Top-down approach, if you can only use, you only have time for some reason, you only can access one kind of approach in preparing students to read. Top-down approach, accessing schema. Schema theory was right. Accessing schema really is the way to go. And of course, that means last and least, I was going to say last but not least, but it is last and least the bottom-up approach. It is the lesser of the effective approaches. Okay. So the 1970s, the 1980s were kind of this interesting time where you saw people abandoning the ship of the bottom-up approach and abandoning their clinging to grammatical competency and really starting to pay attention to how students make meaning out of a text. And of course, at this time too, there was Delheim's work with communicative competencies, and we've already talked about them a little bit. And communicative competencies, just to kind of go back over it, jar your memory a little bit. Communicative competencies means, what do real people really need to be successful with carrying out a task? Whether that's giving a talk, asking a question, reading a text, writing an email, whatever it is. What do they need to be successful? And I need to add a word, successful enough. Before communicative competencies, our focus was perfect all the time. So if you weren't performing at 100% according to grammar translation method, according to the way we used to approach language, if you weren't operating at 100%, you weren't operating. Communicative competencies, Delheim's theory says, no, we just need to do well enough. And often well enough in our profession means 80%. That's often a term that will come up. For example, in the English Language Institute for international students here on our campus, to pass from one level to another, it's at 80%. If you've gotten 80% on quizzes and tests and all the different kinds of assessments, then you move on to the next level. And I think that's a really kind of nice, concrete placeholder to help us remember. You don't have to do perfect, you just have to do well enough. And that's what communicative competency is about. And of course, the competencies is all about, well, what does that look like? What do good language learners and language users, what are they able to do? So we've talked about grammatical competency, that once again, that's kind of where we anchored ourselves. That's where we put all of our money for a long time. And then we moved to a sense of discourse competency and social linguistic competency being very important for the skill of reading. There's another one here too that I haven't talked about, strategic competency. And something interesting happened at the maybe mid to late 1980s, and that is that we started to really ask the question, what do good readers do? What does a good reader do? Because shouldn't that really kind of direct what we do with our learners and how we guide them and the kinds of things that we put in front of them? And so what I want to do is to walk you through, what did we find at that point? What did we find at that point? And this last period here, the 1990s, let me turn it a little bit. This last period, the 1990s, what you're going to see is you're going to see us shift our teaching, really following the trail of what do good readers do. And as the International Reading Association and other big groups continue to kind of bring together and conglomeration of different research findings. We're constantly moving and trying to follow that trail. What do we know now about what good readers do? And to focus our classroom activities around that. So the first thing that we know, number one, literally number one on the list right now since about 2008, good readers read fluently. Now, what does that mean? Fluently is it can be kind of an empty term, and hopefully I'm going to put some meaning to it so that you can kind of grab onto it. To read fluently, Neil Anderson, who's a big big reading researcher in our field, Neil Anderson says that to read fluently means you've got a good rate of speed and you've got enough comprehension. And where those two kind of overlap, that's reading fluency. And so it's moving quickly, so you're moving quickly through the text, but you also have enough understanding. So what's quickly enough? Well, Neil Anderson suggests that with our students, we're constantly reaching for a speed of 200 words per minute. And for accuracy, for that understanding, the comprehension, that we're shooting for 70%. And actually, that's one of the few times that I've heard someone in our field reach below 80% for something. So I was a little surprised when I went back to his research. So why does speed matter? When I was in your shoes and I was hearing this information for the first time, I know that I was a little surprised. I didn't expect at all that the actual speed that we read mattered. Well, let me take it apart for you, and I think it'll make sense. English is a language that's subject, verb, object. Almost all of our sentences have a subject, verb, and many have an object. And if you make sense of a sentence, that means that you're able to logically connect the subject, the verb, and the object. If you move so slowly through a sentence, so you're so slowly decoding each word, by the time you get to the end of the sentence, you won't remember how the sentence began. In other words, by the time you get to the object of the sentence, you won't remember what the subject was, and therefore you can't make meaning. And so there is a kind of a base level speed under which students cannot even make sense of even a fairly simple sentence in English. And so I think that kind of helps us think about and contextualize why it matters that we have students, we help them start to read more quickly. Okay. And so, and I want to keep coming back to that word. It's also fluently, because we need them to also understand at least most of what they're reading as well. So one thing that I wanted to talk about with fluency is I wanted to make sure that we talk about what is the actual decoding that they're getting faster at. And one of the pieces is recognizing vocabulary almost as sight words. So if you're not sure what that means, probably if you go back in your memory to your time in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, probably you'll remember when you were sent home with your teacher with some sight word lists. And these were words that your teacher wanted you to learn as soon as your eye touched the word on a page. You instantly recognized it, so you didn't have to sound it out. You just, on sight, you recognize the word. And so this really plays into part of what we need to happen for our students. We need them to recognize on sight most of the words that they encounter. And when they encounter a new word, that they're able to sound it out. And so this is where the phoneme-grapheme relationship comes in. If they see an L on the page, that they're able to start reaching for the different kinds of sounds that an L makes. In English, there's a forward L, ol, and there's a back L, velar L, ol, which you probably can't hear the difference, but my tongue is forward, my tongue is back. And so reaching for that sound to attempt to kind of take the word apart, see what the sounds are, and then make sense of that word. A quick note here. If you're working with native speaking students who are learning how to read in English as their first language, so let's say you're working with first graders, you're a first grade teacher. If you're helping students sound out a word and their home is English speaking, they've been exposed to English their whole lives, then once they're able to sound out the word, they will actually recognize it with their ear, probably. It's probably a word they've heard so many times, whether it was on television or from their parents or at school, but they'll recognize the word and they'll actually recognize it through their ear. So sounding it out is the way to make meaning. That's very different if you're working with a first grader who is tackling vocabulary. They don't have very much of a vocabulary in English. Just because they can sound it out and hear it is not going to necessarily trigger meaning. So one difference between your native speaking students and your non-native speaking students is you need to do more work with vocabulary learning just as much as you do with that phoneme-grapheme relationship, and making sure they can decode very quickly so that every time they come to the letter R, they remember that sound. They don't have to think for a moment, which letter is that? What sound does that make? That kind of thing. So, so it's part decoding the phoneme-grapheme relationship, it's part vocabulary, and it's also part strategies. So what do you do when you come to a word that you don't know? And if you walk into a first or second grade classroom, you might see environmental print that actually goes down the steps of what do you do when you don't know a word. And often there actually, there's pictures to go with it or some kind of icon. Because of course, by definition, the kids are just learning how to read. So having a lot of words on a page isn't going to solve anything. So what kinds of strategies do we teach students? We teach them to try to sound it out. We teach them to get your mouth ready for the sound and just start making the sound. We teach them to look around, the words around it, and make a guess. What might the word be? If they're really stuck, we teach them to move on and keep going. So that is some of the strategies that good readers use so that they read fluently. So what are some other things that we can do to support our students with reading fluently? We can attempt to get their speed up. How can we do that? We can do something called shadow reading. And there's lots of different versions of what it looks like. Kind of a multi-step version of shadow reading would be students with their books closed, they simply listen to a text read aloud. Usually that's the teacher reading aloud. So they're just sitting and listening. With the second time, the text is open and they are following along with their eyes as the teacher is doing the reading. And the third time, they join the class and the teacher in a choral reading. So they're doing that as well. And maybe the next time they're doing silent reading, moving their finger at a certain rate. Or it could be even that the teacher is making a sound at the end of each line, so students know when they hear that sound they need to move to the next line, whether they're ready or not. So that would be one way that you could move along reading. When I was taught to support my students with developing reading fluency way back long ago in the 90s, I was taught to use reading speed programs. So there are actual texts out there to help English language learners develop faster reading speed. They might be used with native speaking students as well, but they're marketed mostly. And one of the things that I'll have you take a look at after you follow this lecture, and I'm not saying read, but just take a look at, is a sample text that someone placed online. So you can see the kinds of readings, you can see how the lines are actually marked, and you can see that it comes with comprehension questions. And the way it works is that every time you put a new reading in front of students, so you might say, okay, everyone turn to page 39, and there they would see a text, usually it's on one page, and you would give the same amount of time every day for the reading. And students would mark which line they made it to when the timer was up. And then there are comprehension questions that go with it. They answer those and they self-grade them and come up with their score. And what I did was I kept track of those. I sent a paper around and students would fill in their score and how many lines they made it to. And you can actually see development with that kind of thing. So another thing that you can do with students is you can incorporate extensive reading into your teaching, and I highly suggest that you do. And extensive reading is right down here. Let's see. So extensive reading. Extensive reading is more like the way I think Stephen Krashen imagined reading, as kind of a vehicle carrying students to amazing language proficiency gains. Extensive reading is reading that's either at the student's level or just a little bit below. And I think ideally for me, a little bit below is better for extensive reading. So the level is already below their reading level, and so in Stephen Krashen terms, he would say I-1. And it is highly interesting. So either the student or the teacher or luck or fate has played a role in connecting the student with a text that's of high interest to them. They are really motivated to read this particular text, and that motivation should carry them through. I went through a stage in my younger years in which I read Westerns in German. Now, this is kind of weird because I don't like Western movies. I've never read a Western text in English, but for some reason, I enjoyed reading Western novels in German. And so I learned a lot of vocabulary in German, just picking it up, not through a dictionary, but just picking it up through general meaning. Words like the word for rattlesnake or tumbleweed or boots, that kind of thing. And so that's a really good kind of sense of the kind of just enjoyment that we're looking at with extensive reading. Extensive reading means that students are simply reading for the gist. They're looking for the gist. And if they don't understand a detail, they don't understand a detail. They just keep moving on. But the focus is always on making meaning, and that motivation is moving them through. So if there's a page in which there are a lot of vocabulary that they don't know, even though technically there shouldn't be, because it's I-1, it's slightly below their level, well, they just keep making it through. And so this is a fantastic way to build up reading fluency for your students, is to build this in some way into your teaching. And so extensive reading texts are longer than the kinds of texts that we tackle in class. And there's very little, if any, classroom direction. It might be that if you give the same extensive reading text to all of your students, maybe you have fourth graders who are all reading the novel Holes, for example. You might do something like saying, okay, everyone, so over the weekend, I want you to read chapter 3, and just let's think about this question for a moment. What would you do if? And then you get everyone thinking about that question, and you say, well, let's see what our character does. So any instruction that's given at all around the text is very minimal and really just focused on what is that main idea, what can the students be getting from the text. So that's extensive reading, a great way to build up reading fluency. And I have up here kind of its partner, intensive reading. Intensive reading refers to what we're usually doing with reading. with our learners, whether they're native speakers or English language learners. And that is, with that interactive approach, tackling what is going on in this reading. And one thing that I figured out a few years in was that when you put a reading in front of students, either because you're required to, it's part of the curriculum, or because you're matching students with something that they're interested in right now, or you're building on kind of a topic you've been following. You are not, with intensive reading, simply preparing students to read this particular text, but rather you are also preparing them to read every text like this that they encounter. So, for example, if you put a reading in front of students and there's lots of headings, and the headings really do a great job of helping the reader predict what's coming in the section and to see even how the sections connect with each other, then if I would fully expect, if I were to sit in on your class, that with your intensive reading or your pre-reading or your dream reading you're doing with the students, that you would be drawing their attention to those headings and getting them to kind of fully exploit them for the meaning that they can either predict or make of the meaning in the text. And not just for that particular reading. What I figured out is really you're preparing them for every text like it. So your hope is that when they leave your class that day, that one of the things they take with them is this idea, long after Gina is no longer my teacher, long after you are no longer their teacher, when they're encountering really difficult reading for a university course, for their work, for whatever it is, and there's headings, aha, this is a way they can tackle the reading, this is a way they can make predictions, this is a way they can check their understanding, and this is the way they can see how the different sections connect with each other. So, intensive reading, you look at what the text has to offer, what the challenging pieces are, but you're also looking at what can I exploit about this text that my students could then take with them and apply to every text like it. So intensive reading is mostly what we do in classrooms. Extensive reading usually happens outside of classrooms. Now in K through 12, especially in elementary, a lot of schools use sustained silent reading, SSR, or some version of that. And that is essentially extensive reading. Or some people say stop, drop, and read. They have like the last 10 minutes of every other hour. It's stop, drop, and read. And students go to a corner, they grab a book, whether it's something they've been reading or it's a new text, and they simply read. And the teacher doesn't discuss what they're reading. It's all independent. It's all individualized. And that's how that plays out. So those are really important concepts for us to understand, and I hope that you hear that research is highly on the side of including extensive reading. Not only does it, as we're talking about here, support reading fluency, but some other almost, I'm going to say this word, almost magical effects happen with extensive reading. There have been a huge number of studies across different populations, different countries, different age groups, different purposes for reading. And what they have found is not only does reading fluency go up, but vocabulary goes way up. So it is an amazing way for students to develop their vocabulary. And when students encounter words like that, they're not being taught, they simply encounter them and they make some inferred understanding of it. That is a really key way to grow students' vocabulary. Other kind of less, they still don't quite make sense to me, but they show up in research findings. Students' writing abilities go up. And I guess that makes sense, right? I mean, the more you're exposed to the way that English is written, the way discourses work, the way people begin a paragraph, the way ideas tend to flow, then that starts to show up in your writing. Also, very bizarre, pronunciation improves. And that one just makes no sense to me. And actually, even though I mention it at this point in the quarter to this class every year, I almost didn't quite believe the research findings, but here's my own personal anecdote that I think it's right. And that is that one way that I work on my Spanish is I try to do some reading every day. A lot of my Twitter feeds are actually in Spanish, so I'm following Twitter accounts that are in Spanish. I try to read news articles in Spanish every day. I have a little book, a mini book, that I carry with me in my bag, so if I ever have a few minutes extra waiting for kids or something, I can read in Spanish. And so I'm constantly trying to take in a little bit of Spanish every day and just kind of pushing myself through it. I also read People magazine in Spanish. That's kind of my dirty little language secret. And my husband has been commenting over the years that my pronunciation has gotten so much better in Spanish. And what he notices is it's not after I get back from a trip to Nicaragua, but rather it's from these big bouts of extensive reading in Spanish. So, you know what? I think they're right. Okay, so all of this talking I've been doing over the last few minutes has been entirely around good readers read fluently. And that means that has a lot of implications for us as teachers, for me as a teacher. So let's quickly go through. What else do we know about what good readers do? Good readers are able to extend the text. They're able to do something with it. They're able to critique it. They're able to expand it. They're able to elaborate on it. They're able to change the meaning, change the ending rather, to something that they like better, that kind of thing. And so that means that good readers have some control over the text. They're not just decoding, but rather they kind of own this thing. And how can we guide our students to own this thing with a text in our classroom? We can think very carefully about what we're doing after students do a reading. We can give them questions that cause them to change the story in ways that they like better. We can ask them to evaluate the ideas, to critique the ideas. We can point out a paragraph where an author starts to say something but doesn't quite finish and ask them, how would you finish that kind of thing. So good readers are able to do something with the text, not just decode it, they're able to do something with it. And that has implications for us, for what we do with our students in class. Also, good readers use various strategies as they're tackling text. So this has a lot of implications for us. In our second language acquisition course, we looked at Rebecca Oxford's work around the different, she did some really great taxonomy work with looking at the different kinds of language learning strategies that are out there. And we really need to, at all times, be very cognizant before we put a text in front of our students. Be cognizant of the kinds of strategies we're using to make sense of the text. And then to ask ourselves, in addition, if I were struggling with making sense of this text, what could I do? And so it's not just a matter of reaching randomly for one of Rebecca Oxford's language learning strategies and applying it, saying, okay, today the strategy of the day is this, because it's kind of this random thing. But rather really think about what makes sense for this text. And then you need to teach your students the language learning strategy. You need to encourage them to use it. You need to remind them later that it's part of their repertoire. And when students have really good sense of what the different strategies are, they've had experience with you, with intensive reading with them, then if you assign a reading to students for homework, one of your questions might be to the class, take a look at it. which language learning strategy are you going to apply? And ask them what they're using. So what Neil Anderson found and many others is that even those who are good readers in their first language, when they read in English, they often don't bring those strategies with them. So a strategy that I might use in English, I might not bring with me naturally into Spanish. Why? I don't know. I think maybe we just get overwhelmed when we're reading in a second language. So the teacher needs to play the role of making sure that students know about, they know how to use, they have practice using, and reminding them to use these strategies. And one thing that you might do is to ask students, if you were reading this text in your first language, what could you do if you struggled with meaning, and see if that isn't a way, kind of a route to bring in a strategy from the first language. Okay. So another thing that learners, good language learners do when they read is they apply schema. And that totally makes sense, right? We now know how important the top-down approach is. So if you think about your intensive reading instruction with students, one thing you can be thinking about is you are setting up your students for success by getting them to look at the headings, make a prediction from the pictures, turn the title into a question, make some predictions about where the main idea is, read quickly for the main idea, that kind of thing. And you're not just setting them up for success with that particular reading, but hopefully you are teaching them they need to access schema with every reading that they encounter, even if it's something that it's just a newspaper article, or it's a very quick and easy essay that they'll read for, say, their English class later as a university student. And so just as I said before, with all of these, with everything you do with intensive reading, it's not just for that particular day, for that particular reading, but really your great hope, what you're striving for, is you're sending your students away thinking, when I read in English, this is the way I roll. When I read in English, this is the way I roll. So you want them to pack up those language learning strategies and take them with them. And that includes accessing schema, the main idea, the purpose, etc. Okay. And another thing, another thing that students do is that they are very cognizant, when they're good readers, they're very cognizant of the purpose for which they are reading a text. They have a sense of what the purpose is that they're reading, and they match how they kind of tackle the text with that purpose. And here is where we need to talk about the difference between skimming and scanning. And I know you know these words, but it's very likely that they've kind of floated away from their meaning and they're kind of jumbled in your mind. So think of it this way. We skim a text looking for the main idea. So we move our eye across the entire thing looking for the main idea, trying to get the general picture. And so skimming means moving quickly over the entire thing. And you're really just trying to get a sense of the big picture. Scanning, you're moving quickly, but that's the only way the two ideas overlap. With scanning, you are looking for one specific detail, and you're looking quickly across the text until you find it, and then you're out. Okay, so you're looking quickly, and then you find it. So for example, if you say to your students, okay, I want you to skim the reading, and then at the end, I want you to write down what you think the story is going to be about. Okay, so that is an example of skimming. You're asking them to move quickly through the entire text for the big idea. Scanning is the way I don't even know if any of us have anymore. We used to have phone books, right? And if you're looking for the phone number for a grocery store somewhere, you're quickly moving through, you find the place on the page where it has the phone number. Once you find it, you're done. So you're looking for this one specific thing and then you're out of there. So two very different purposes for reading, two different ways to engage with the text. And so really good readers, they know things like that. They know the difference between that. And of course, you need to know that as a teacher as well. And how can we support this for students? Besides getting them comfortable with these two different kinds of reading, here is something that I really believe. I'm supported with research here, but I really, really believe it. And that is, with intensive reading, every time you give your students reading to do, they need to have a purpose for carrying it out. And I think for many of us who want to be teachers, for a lot of us, not all of us, but for a lot of us, reading came really easily. In fact, we might have been ahead of the schedule in learning how to read, and we read at an early age, and books were our refuge. We curled up with a good book whenever we got time. We loved to pack a book when we went on vacation, that kind of thing. And so for a lot of us, reading is, it's a really pleasurable thing, and I think we kind of extend that. We assume that will be the case for our language learners. I'd like to disrupt that and give you a different image. I think for most people who are reading in English as a second language or as a foreign language, it is like rushing into a burning building. That's what reading looks like to them. And so if you think about it that way, that it's not this wonderful, pleasurable refuge that it might be for you, but rather it's rushing into a burning building. Stop and think for a moment. Why in the world would anyone go into a burning building? The only reason they would go in is to rescue a person, to rescue a pet, or to rescue something specific that has great, amazing meaning to them. Maybe value, monetary value, but I think really it's more meaning. And so that's the way you need to approach purpose for your students with reading. When you tell them to go home and read a text, you need to tell them what it is they're going in to get, because they are rushing into a burning building. So I'd like you to kind of hold that image in your head. That is highly important, I think, to disrupting this idea that reading is simply pleasurable, because what it should remind you every time you assign reading is you need to give a purpose. Now remember, with extensive reading, that's different. That's different. They're simply reading for the gist, and with a lot of teachers, students are completely in control of that. With me, I'm completely in control of my own extensive reading. I don't need a purpose to be assigned. I'm simply kind of enjoying the reading about things that are of interest to me and kind of moving through the text even when I don't fully understand. So purpose, very important. Good readers always are aware of what the purpose for reading is, and they match their reading to the purpose. Okay. And finally, good readers have a positive attitude towards reading. They think of it as a positive thing. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they are, that they see it as pleasurable, but rather they are able to see ways that it connects with what their goals are. And so what are the implications for us as teachers? I think the implications are, first of all, wherever possible to make it pleasurable. So even if you have certain readings that you're required by your curriculum to use, see if you can't start every day's lesson with a quick 2-minute read, a joke that you know the students will enjoy. Or if they're all obsessed with some, let's say you're teaching adults in Japan and they're all obsessed with a certain Hollywood star, it's a paragraph describing the Hollywood star, that kind of thing. So wherever possible, if possible, do try to make it pleasurable through connecting with their interests, connecting with their hobbies, connecting with what motivates them, that kind of thing. And another way that I think there's kind of a to-do list for us as instructors is to set them up for success as much as possible. So going back to that interactive approach and making sure that they are fully prepared, they don't have big gaps in their understanding before they tackle a reading. And also, I think another job for us, especially for those of us who are teaching at the secondary or the adult level, is to connect students with, connect the readings with what students' goals are. And so I think if we can find a way to show students that, yeah, this reading might not, make your heart beat faster, but when you think about what you're going to have to do in this job, or when you think about what you're going to have to do as an engineering major, this reading text makes sense. So try to connect it, maybe, even if it doesn't in the short term interest them, with their long-term goals. So I think that that's another implication for us. So what I'm hoping happened with today's lecture is that you have a sense that even though for a lot of people the popular imagination thinks of reading as this very passive thing, as just kind of a thing of refuge, a thing of pleasure, that kind of thing, that doesn't take much effort, it's a solo activity. Really, almost the opposite is true for language learners who are really challenged by how to improve their reading in English. And so, to hit the highlights again, we know now that we started in our profession very much firmly with this idea that the bottom-up approach is the way to go with preparing students for success. But now we know that optimal is we use the interactive approach, where we're accessing grammar approach, grammatical competency, we're using top-down approach, which includes sociolinguistic and also discourse, but also looking at purpose, looking at the main idea, the big ideas, the different parts of the reading, and what students can expect, what kinds of questions might be answered. And we now know that natural approach and schema theory really had a big part to play in our moving to the top-down approach. And then Patricia Carroll's kind of stop everything, let's find out the truth research study showed us that the interactive approach really is optimal for language learners. We now know that reading fluency is incredibly important, and reading speed, there is kind of a reading speed that is optimal, and actually not just optimal, but if students don't have it, they can't even comprehend the text. I mentioned that Neil Anderson suggests that we're reaching for 200 words per minute to be read by our students, and 70% understanding. At the end of third grade, if you're teaching elementary students, you'll probably have specific guidelines that you're following for your school district. But in general, at the end of third grade, students are reading about 110 words a minute, and they add about 10 words a minute every year after that. And then it jumps again with university work. And so we know that reading speed matters, not just accuracy, not just understanding, but that does matter. And I hope that you now have a sense of kind of what intensive reading instruction looks like in a classroom. And next week, with next week's lecture, you'll get a more granular sense of what those activities can look like. But I hope you have a sense, at least the big picture of what the instruction looks like. And also, to keep in mind, you're not instructing for today, you're instructing for tomorrow. You're not just for instructing students with this reading text so that your students can tackle it today, but rather that they can tackle tomorrow's text without you on their own. And that you have a really good sense that extensive reading really, really matters. That you have a sense of skimming and scanning. And, I didn't talk about this very quickly, that you have a sense of the kinds of questions you're asking your students, whether orally or you're creating, if you create a questionnaire guide for them. Very quickly, I just kind of want to go over this, that before you teach your first reading class, you might not have thought about the very different kinds of questions that we put in front of students to kind of gauge their understanding, gauge how much control they have over the reading. But thin questions are questions that can be answered just by going back to the text. For beginners, for low intermediate students, that's a big deal. That can be a really big deal. Thick questions are those that can only be answered by inference. And so students need to kind of put together ideas and then make sense of them. And so these are another two pieces. Education researcher named Schachter came up with those definitions, and I think that's really important for us to think about. You need both, but as your students become more and more advanced, you certainly need to be reaching more and more for those thick questions. Okay, so this is kind of a whirlwind look at the big picture and kind of a little bit of the history of how we have approached language teaching in our profession. I hope it gives you the big picture. And where I want you to go from now, there are some textbook readings that cover some of the same big pieces that I just covered, and also some videos that accompany it that go with our classroom text, our course text. What I'd like you to be doing as you are doing those readings is look at the pieces that match up with what I've just shared with you. It's very possible that you'll see that some of the areas of the text are saying something very similar or building on the same ideas, but just not saying them in the same words. So what I'd like you to do is to read those textbook readings, the excerpts that I have below this lecture. Read them to look for what matches up and what doesn't with what I've shared today, what kind of builds in a different direction on that, the big picture. Okay, so now I've given you a purpose for rushing into what might feel to you like a burning building. For some students, even reading in the first language is not pleasurable, and it's like moving into a burning building. So good luck, and I will see you in the discussion.